Hello, Mindy Mandell here, and I'm continuing this series of videos on the Republic. As you can see, I'm getting into Book 4 today. I'm actually going to start at the end of Book 3 because that's going to lead us into Book 4. So Book 3 ends with Socrates describing the living conditions of these members of his fictitious city-state that he's calling the Guardians. And they have a very modest, simple lifestyle. He says, and there's a very long description, I pulled out just a little bit from it. And by the way, before I read this, I do want to point out all of our translations, as I've done throughout the Republic, are from Paul Shorey, but I am adjusting them to put them into script form because I think it's the easier way to present it to you. All right, so in the first place, none must possess any private property save the indispensable. And secondly, none must have any habitation or treasure house which is not open for all to enter at will. Their food should be in such quantities as are needful for athletes of war who are sober and brave. And it goes on and on and on. Now, what I would recommend whenever you read a passage like this that on the surface just seems either overbearing or it just doesn't make any sense at all, immediately jump to that analogy of the soul and ask yourself, what state of soul is he describing here? If you were to apply this to the soul, what state of soul would it create? So we see here that the soldiers all live together. They have no private property, no privacy really. They have only what they need. What it's creating is a state of unity in the soul. If you were to apply this to the soul, then it would be a state of unity within the soul. A situation where there are no distractions or competing, conflicting desires pulling you one way or another. And so, because this is the end of Book 3, where he described the education of these guardians, the implication here is that this state of soul would result from that education. And so that is going to bring us now into Book 4, where Adimantus, who's been listening to this, it's been Glaucon up to this point talking with Socrates, and now Adimantus is going to jump in and say, looking at the surface story, he's going to say, this is a horrible way to live. So he says, what will be your defense, Socrates, if anyone objects that you're not making these men very happy, and that through their own fault, for the city really belongs to them, and yet they get no enjoyment out of it as ordinary men do by owning lands and building fine big houses. And there's much more description, and then he ends by saying, but they seem, one might say, to be established in idleness in the city, exactly like hired mercenaries, with nothing to do but keep guard. And it's at this point that Socrates reminds him, and by extension us as the reader, that we're not really building a city here. What we're doing is creating an analogy that allows us to understand the soul. So we don't have to create a city where everybody has the best life possible. We have to think about the city as a whole because we want to look at the soul as a whole. These are not real people. They represent some aspect of soul, which means that each member or each class, each type of person within the city-state represents some aspect of soul. It's like they're two-dimensional characters. They're not full people. And so the role of the guardians is only to guard. So it's correct. They are functioning in this way. Now, I think that for those of us who do not live in a military state, it's rather disconcerting, this idea that the military owns the city. But otherwise, I think that we can all relate to what Adimantus says here. It's just that we're not building a real city. The role of these people, of the soldiers, is only to keep guard. So that's why they function this way. And Socrates says, while it would not surprise us if these men thus living proved to be the most happy, yet the object on which we fixed our eyes in the establishment of our states was not the exceptional happiness of any one class, but the greatest possible happiness of the city as a whole. For we thought that in a state so constituted, we should be most likely to discover justice, as we should injustice in the worst governed state, and that when we had made these out, we could pass judgment on the issue of our long inquiry. So a reminder that this is just an analogy, because we want to look for justice in the soul. And then a reminder that the guardians have a very important role within this analogy. But guardians of laws and of the city, who are not what they pretend to be but only seem, destroy utterly, I would have you note, the entire state. And on the other hand, they alone are decisive of its good government and happiness. So this role of guarding what he's calling here the laws, the beliefs about the nature of reality and what is good and right and true, that aspect of the soul that guards what we know to be true and guards the city as a whole, the soul as a whole, that role is key to our health, to our well-being. And then the next point is this idea of unity. Now, this has been harped on in many different ways already throughout this dialogue. We're going to see it continues to be a theme as we go forward. This idea of unity, we saw it with the distinction between imitation and narration. When we're imitating, we feel fractured. Sometimes we're imitating one member of the family, sometimes another. We act one way with this group, another way with another. We're not functioning in a unified way. We saw it also at the beginning of this video with the idea of all the guardians living together, sharing everything in a community way. That's, again, creating the idea of unity in the soul. And here it is again stated more directly. I think that if they should let it grow, let the city grow, so long as in its growth it consents to remain a unity, but no further. Excellent. Then is not this still another injunction that we should lay upon our guardians, to keep guard in every way, that the city shall not be too small, nor great only in seeming, but that it shall be a sufficient city and one. So one of the key roles of the guardians is to keep the city from becoming fractured. And so, by analogy, one of the key roles that we must guard within our own soul is maintaining that unity of the soul. And moreover, the state, if it once starts well, proceeds, as it were, in a cycle of growth. I mean that a sound nurture and education, if kept up, create good natures in the state, and sound natures in turn, receiving an education of this sort, develop into better men than their predecessors. Okay, so in the city, we can talk about future generations. However, that obviously doesn't make sense when we're talking about our own soul's growth. So what I think this refers to in the soul is that our education is cumulative. What he called music, that purification of false beliefs, that belief in what is true about the nature of reality and the state of mind that grows from that initial purification. Gymnastics, remember, described as that energy that we build that keeps us focused and that keeps our conviction in keeping forward and going forward with this way of life. Our study of metaphysics, the laws, and understanding why, because we don't just accept these laws. Remember that God is good in reality, and also that God doesn't change shape or form, that God abides always in one form. These are the laws that were presented, but we don't just accept them because Plato said so. We need to understand why they're true, and that means a study of philosophy, a study of metaphysics in particular. And so these studies are not things you do just once. It's not like you do this purification once and then you're done, or gymnastics, this energy building. It's just once and then you're done. It's more of a cumulative effect, that each time we engage in these activities, we're creating a new foundation for the next layer of growth, if you will. And so it builds and builds and builds. Okay, now the next thing they jump on is this idea that even though we're making lots of rules and laws and talking about we should do this and we should not do that, we don't want to micromanage our lives with lots of strict rules. Yet to enact them into laws would, I think, be silly, for such laws are not obeyed, nor would they last, being enacted only in words and on paper. How could they? At any rate, Adimantus, the direction of the education from whence one starts is likely to determine the quality of what follows. Does not like ever summon like? Surely. What I take out of this is the idea that we don't want to just throw out ideals and talk in this highbrow way that people tend to when they mean well. I don't think anyone actually wants to be a hypocrite, but people who we see as hypocrites, they tend to talk in a lofty way, but they don't really live up to it. They would like to, but they just don't know how. And what he's showing here is that focusing on our education, the direction of the education, is what really determines the quality of what follows. So focus on that, have the humility to do that, and you don't need this highfalutin talk. And he goes on to say that the final outcome, I presume, we would say is one complete and vigorous product of good, or the reverse. Of course. For my part, then, for these reasons, I would not go on to try to legislate on such matters. And with good reason, Adimantus says. And Adimantus goes on to say that it would not be fitting to dictate to good and honorable men. For most of the enactments that are needed about these things, they will easily, I presume, discover. Yes, my friend, provided God grants them the preservation of the principles of law that we've already discussed. That's foreshadowing of the virtues that are about to come up. Failing that, Adimantus says, they will pass their lives multiplying such petty laws and amending them in the expectation of attaining what is best. And what Adimantus is describing here is really most of us. We mean well, we want to grow, we want to learn, we want to be wise. We don't necessarily have a plan, though, so we kind of pick from this philosopher and that one, or we like this idea from Buddhism and that one from Hinduism, and we try many different things, and again, we may talk in some lofty, idealistic way that we don't really live up to. We try some things, we kind of slide in other ways. What I see in Platonism is a framework, if you will, of a spiritual life, of a way of life. And I see the Republic as the closest thing that Plato gave us to a spiritual guide. He's not giving us a lot of methods. He does give us dialectic and some other dialogues. He doesn't tell us exactly how to do music or how to do gymnastics. What he's giving us is what we need. These are the steps we need. These are the things that we're going to need to work on. And we have some leeway, depending on our own personality and lifestyle, of how exactly we're going to go about it. But he's giving us the basic framework of what we need to do. And so this is a way of life that we can follow. And if we follow along this, rather than talking in lofty ways, if we actually are focused and have the humility and the determination to live this way, we're going to figure it out and we're going to get it right. All right, well, the rest of book 4 is going on to the virtues. Now, I do have an earlier video that I did on the virtues. There is quite a bit of overlap between that video and this one because a lot of the quotes in that video actually come from book 4 here of the Republic. However, what I'm going to do today is look precisely at the way that the virtues are covered here in book 4. So we have wisdom, courage, in this translation, soberness. I used the word temperance in that earlier video, but it's the same sophrosune in Greek. And then justice. Now, justice, of course, is the focus of this entire dialogue. Remember, Socrates was given the challenge of trying to show why justice in the soul is a virtue in and of itself, even if a person does not have the reputation of being just. Now, because the focus is justice, there's quite a bit on justice in this chapter, in this book. And so justice is actually going to get a whole video of its own. Today, what I'm going to cover is wisdom, courage, and soberness, and that is going to be kind of the setup, if you will, for next week's video on justice. Okay, with that set up, let's get into it. We're starting with wisdom. And Socrates defines wisdom as good counsel. He says this very thing, good counsel, is a form of wisdom. For it is not by ignorance, but by knowledge, that men counsel well. And then he goes on to say that he asks, is there any science in the city just founded by us, residing in any of its citizens, which does not take counsel about some particular thing in the city, but rather about the city as a whole and the betterment of its relations with itself and other states? Why, yes, there is. And notice here that Glaucon now has jumped back in. So Glaucon and Erymanthus are both historically the brothers of Plato, and they kind of tag team each other throughout this dialogue. So Erymanthus had jumped in for the early part of Book 4. Now Glaucon has come back. So he's saying, yes, there is something in the city that focuses on the betterment of the city as a whole. And Socrates asks, what is it, and in whom is it found? It is the science of guardianship or government, and it is to be found in those rulers to whom we just now gave the name of guardians in the full sense of the word. And what term then do you apply to the city because of this knowledge? He says it is well advised and truly wise. Now I want to go back specifically to this statement here. First of all, these rulers. Now you might recall that when the soldiers class was created, they were called guardians, and we took out the best of those guardians and called them rulers. Now what we're finding is that these rulers represent that part of the soul where wisdom takes hold, that it focuses on wisdom. And we're going to see next week that rulers are sometimes called counselors because they're described as good counsel. Now also this idea of guardians in the full sense of the word, meaning now before we had a guardian class of which the rulers were the best of those guardians, but now he's going to start calling these rulers, sometimes he calls them counselors, he's also going to call them guardians. From here on in, when he uses the word guardian, he means only the rulers. And he's going to give other names to the guardians, the helpers and other such terms. Okay, so these guardians, these rulers, these counselors are the home of wisdom in the soul. And now we're going to talk about the size of it. Which class, then, do you suppose will be the more numerous in our city? The smiths or these true guardians? The smiths by far. And would not these rulers be the smallest of all the groups of those who possess special knowledge and receive distinctive appellations? By far. So we haven't yet got to the tripartite soul. For those of you familiar with it, or those of you who have seen my earlier video where I discussed it, you can already kind of see the foreshadowing that the smallest aspect of the soul is the home of wisdom. It is by virtue of its smallest class and minutest part of itself, in the wisdom that resides therein, in the part which takes the lead and rules, that a city established on principles of nature would be wise as a whole. And as it appears, these are by nature the fewest, the class to which it pertains to partake of the knowledge which alone of all forms of knowledge deserves the name of wisdom. Most true. Okay, so that is wisdom as discussed in the Republic. And now we're going to go on to courage. Now, to explain what courage is, Socrates gives an interesting example. He's going to talk about taking some white wool and dyeing the color, and what it takes for that dye to take hold. And he's going to tie that into courage. So let's see how he does it. He says, you're aware that dyers, when they wish to dye wool so as to hold the purple hue, begin by selecting from the many colors there be the one nature of the white, and then give it a careful preparatory treatment, so that it will take the hue in the best way, and after the treatment, then and only then, dip it in the dye. And things that are without lies cannot take away the sheen of their hues, but otherwise you know what happens to them, whether anyone dips other colors or even these without the preparatory treatment. By this analogy, then, you must conceive what we too, to the best of our ability, were doing, when we selected out soldiers and educated them in music and exercises of the body. The sole aim of our contrivance was that they should be convinced and receive our laws like a die, as it were, so that their belief and faith might be fast colored about both the things that are to be feared and all other things, because of the fitness of their nature and nurture, and that so their dyes might not be washed out by those lies that have such dread power to scour our faiths away, pleasure more potent than any detergent or astringent to accomplish this, and pain and fear and desire more sure than any lie. So going back to the first half of this long quote, we see the nature of the white. So when you're talking about wool, the white is the most pure. And this really describes most of us. It doesn't mean you have to be an angel. It's just that most of us are basically good, but we're raised in crazy societies, like the Buddha calls society mass insane asylum. And some of us have kooky parents, and so we're raised with some false beliefs. And that is why, although we're basically good, and so we start with that pure nature, but we do need that preparatory treatment. And that's the initial purification, the initial education that he called music and gymnastics, as I described it in past videos. And it's then and only then that it can be dipped in the dye. So the laws that we built music on, we initially maybe only take them as hypotheses to test, but as our purification gets underway, if we're sincere about it, and we start thinking about the kinds of things that were covered in the early dialogues of Plato's, then it starts to take hold. We start to see value in them. We start to think about things differently. And we start to see that these are not just interesting ideas, but there may be something good and true about these ideas. They start to change us. And that's when it starts to take hold of us. And when it takes hold, he calls this being fast colored. And this is where courage comes in, that we recognize if you know what is true, then you know, and you know what is false, then you know what is to be feared and what is not a true fear. When he talks about the lies here, not lies, although that's one of the lies, he's talking about pleasures, he's talking about pain, fear, and desire. And these, with courage to hold fast to what we believe, we will not be distracted by what he's comparing here to the lies, to the soaps and the things that wash away the dye. And that is analogous to pleasure, pain, fear, and desire. So here's his definition of courage. This power in the soul, then, this unfailing conservation of right and lawful belief about things to be and not to be feared, is what I call and would assume to be courage. Okay, and then the last thing to look at today is soberness, or what in other translations is sometimes called temperance or sound-mindedness, and there are a few other translations as well. So here's the way he introduces it, the way he transitions from courage to soberness. Socrates says, if there were only some way to discover justice so that we need not further concern ourselves about soberness. Well, I, for my part, neither know of any such way, nor would I wish justice to be discovered first if that means that we're not to go on to the consideration of soberness. But if you desire to please me, consider this before that. And Socrates replies, it would certainly be very wrong of me not to desire it. Okay, I think I should point out here that this is a joke. And I think I need to point it out because it's not funny. But there is something significant about this little joke because it does hold within it the definition of what Plato means by sophrosun, which is the Greek word soberness or temperance or whatever. So in its fullest flowering, if you will, soberness is when the desires naturally fall in line with what is good and right. So Socrates saying here that it would be wrong of me not to desire having this discussion with you means that it's something that is good and right. And so it would be a lack of temperance or lack of soberness not to want this. So that's the joke. All right, but that's also the definition of soberness. Now, to describe it, he doesn't come right out and say that. Instead, he uses words like concord and harmony or beautiful order. So it bears more likeness of a kind of concord and harmony than the other virtues. Soberness is a kind of beautiful order, and he also describes it as a continence of certain pleasures and appetites. So this last part especially, the continence of certain pleasures and appetites, it's like self-restraint. And so there's a common image that what Plato means by soberness is that we repress our desires. In the early stages of our development, that may very well be what we're doing, that our good sense is overriding some desires. However, in its fullest flowering, it's more of a self-mastery where we're guided by what is wise. He says the expression self-mastery means the control of the worse by the naturally better part. Now, this phrasing again can be misleading if you already had that other idea in mind, because again, it sounds like you're repressing your desires or that you see the desiring part is bad. The word worse sounds like bad. However, if you recognize the wisdom-loving part, or the part of the soul which is the home of wisdom, as the best part of the soul, then just by definition, anything that is not best is worse than the best. It doesn't mean bad, though. The desires are not bad. But when the desires guide us, it means that we have a desire and then we decide if it's healthy for us or not. But if we're guided by wisdom, then the desires would only kick in, if you will, when something is good for us. If we're guided by wisdom, then we'll only desire what is naturally good. And so there's no angel and devil on our shoulders fighting it out. It's more that we just naturally want things that are good for us, and we're naturally turned off to what is unhealthy. And that's the way Socrates is presented, really, throughout all of Plato's dialogues. He's not repressing his unhealthy desires. He's living in a way that he wants to live, and it's a way that is healthy and good. And Socrates says, if there's any city or soul in which the rulers and the ruled are of one mind as to who ought to rule, that condition will be found in this. And so that is the definition of soberness. Now, now in the earlier video that I did on the virtues, I presented the tripartite soul with each of these three virtues that we just looked at as one of those parts. So there's the wisdom-loving part, that's the home of wisdom. The high-spirited part as the home of courage. And the desiring part as the home of temperance or soberness. And that's the way that it's commonly understood, and that's certainly one way to present it. But now that we are looking at it in more depth, and we've come some ways in our understanding of Plato's system, we can look at it in a little bit more detail and say that more specifically, even though we do tend to associate soberness with the desire-loving part of the soul, it actually runs through the whole soul and gives it a kind of balance and harmony. And that's what we're seeing with this quote here. In which class of the citizens, then, will you say that the virtue of soberness has its seat, when this is their condition? In the rulers or in the ruled? And Glaucon says, in both, I suppose. Do you see, then, that our intuition was not a bad one just now, that discerned a likeness between soberness and a kind of harmony? Why so? Because its operation is unlike that of courage and wisdom, which residing in separate parts respectively made the city, the one wise and the other brave. That is not the way of soberness, but it extends literally through the entire gamut throughout, bringing about the unison in the same chant of the strongest, the weakest, and the intermediate, whether in wisdom or, if you please, in strength, or for that matter in numbers, wealth, or any similar criterion, so that we should be quite right in affirming this unanimity to be soberness, the concord of the naturally superior and inferior, as to which ought to rule in both the state and the individual. And he says, I entirely concur. So sometimes you will hear soberness or temperance described as associated with the desire-loving part. But when we're being more precise, it actually runs throughout. And that brings us to the end of today's video. Next week, we're going to go into justice, and we're also going to see more detail about that tripartite soul. So I do hope that you will join me next week. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, please drop me an email or leave it in the comments section below. And as always, I would appreciate a thumbs up, and please think about sharing and subscribing if you don't already, because I do put out a new video each week. Thank you very much. Hope to see you next week.